right. So I'm thrilled to be here to talk to you all about my biggest passion, which is my chosen career path in genetic counseling. Although I'm excited to go back to clinic after this, I'm really bummed that I'm missing dinner with board games and a photo booth, and I'm going to make that recommendation to our conferences to include board games and photo booths at all times. Basically, when Melanie first asked me if I'd be willing to talk about genetic counseling for an hour at this conference, I kind of felt in the same way that I feel when someone says, come on and drive down to the Cape for the weekend. Like, in practice, it first seems like it's going to be really easy, but then you end up in that, trying to get over the bridge. So, the more I thought about it, there's just so much that I want you to know about genetic counseling. So I think what I'm going to attempt to do in this hour is first give you an overview of the profession, because I don't know how many of you have even heard of genetic counseling in this room. Wow, yay! Our publicity's effective, because a lot of times much less people have heard about it. So I'll talk about the profession, I'll talk about the training, because as science librarians, I bet you may encounter more and more students who may be interested in pursuing the field. And then I'll start the conversation on how genetic counselors use the library by talking about some of my own experiences. And then my two colleagues will talk more about their work to just give you a more in-depth perspective. So to start out by talking about the genetic counseling profession, it's first important to define what genetic counseling is. So whenever I tell people that I'm a genetic counselor, the first thing they ask me about is the movie Gattaca, which is definitely a favorite of mine, but that is not, at least at this point in 2018, what genetic counseling is. So basically, our professional organization, the NSGC, defines genetic counseling as the process of helping people understand and adapt to the medical, psychological, and familial implications of the genetic contributions to disease. So when genetic counseling first started, it was really genetic counselors working one-on-one with patients and families. And the genetic counseling process involves three major components. So first, interpretation of family and medical histories to assess the chance of disease occurrence or recurrence. So for example, in Huntington's disease clinic, I generally work with individuals who have a parent or other family member affected with this autosomal dominant adult onset neurological disease. And they come in to first understand if they're at risk, and if so, what is the risk? A lot of times patients have questions about the disease itself. Either their family has some misconceptions, or maybe it's a topic in their family that they don't like talking about. So genetic counselors do make sure that their patients have all the right information about the inheritance pattern of their disease, testing, management, prevention, resources, and ongoing research. And I think the most exciting thing about genetic counseling for many of us is that the field just continues to grow and grow each year. So we often need to be looking for up-to-date information. Even if we just saw a patient for the same indication last week, sometimes things can change very quickly. And then genetic counselors also are in tune to the patient's emotional needs. So we understand that not every person in the same situation is going to make the same decision based upon the information they have. So as genetic counselors, we want to make sure that people choose the path that's right for them and adapt emotionally to that journey, whatever it may be. Now, genetic counselors over time have taken on more varied roles, which I'll address, but when we think about genetic counseling, this is what we're referring to. So the profession is actually fairly new in the grand scheme of things. So the term genetic counseling was first defined in the 1940s by a PhD scientist named Sheldon Reed. So the 1940s were a much different time than now, in that the way genetic disease was viewed at that point was something that we wanted to eliminate or prevent. So families would seek genetic counseling for generally advice on having kids, and if there was a genetic risk thought to be present, the recommendation would be, well, don't have children. So genetic counseling has been involved to be more of a partnership with families and patients, where genetic counselors help families decide what path is right for them, not necessarily with the goal of preventing different conditions from happening. So the first genetic counseling training program started in 1968 at Sarah Lawrence College in Bronxville, New York, and graduated their first class in 1971. So that's pretty amazing that this field has expanded so much and is really still in its infancy. And then the program that I owe not only my current employment to, but my degree, the Brandeis program, was established by Judith Sippis here in 1992. So we've graduated decades of students over time. What's amazing about the field is that genetic counseling, the term, was defined before we even knew the structure of the DNA helix. So it wasn't until 13 years later that we actually knew the DNA structure, thanks to Watson and Crick or Rosalind Franklin, whoever you think was responsible for that. And then over time, as we learned how many chromosomes there were, we were able to sequence DNA. More genetic counselors were able to help families in more and more situations because we simply knew more about genetics. I kind of wish that I took my boards back in like 1957. Like all we knew was that we had DNA and 46 chromosomes, and like that was it. So it's certainly become more complicated over time. And when I entered graduate school, it was in 2003. So that was just 2 years after the first draft of the human genome was published. And I think that was really the beginning of the evolution of our field. And at that time, it was much more expensive to sequence an entire genome, which was really a barrier to much of genetic testing being done. So at that point, if you wanted to sequence a single gene, it maybe would be $5,000 to do that. But now with new technology called next generation sequencing, where you're able to sequence many genes at the same time, it's now possible to sequence someone's entire genome or exome or a panel of genes for a couple $1,000s. So that has really made it possible for patients to seek genetic counseling for a larger variety of indications. And now, as many of you know, and some of us were talking about at breakfast, it's even possible for consumers to order genetic testing themselves through companies like 23andMe or Ancestry.com. Those companies have mixed reviews in the genetic counseling community, but I think they're just making the population as a whole be more familiar with genetics and more interested in understanding their own genetic information. So who are genetic counselors today? So our National Society does do a professional status survey on a regular basis to basically analyze our profession. And so the 2018 version of the survey was just published last month. And so unlike the early days of genetic counseling, now 60% of genetic counselors work directly with patients, whereas the rest either provide a combination of direct and non-direct patient care or only non-direct patient care. And so the evolution of the field has been going in this direction as roles for genetic counselors outside of the clinic are evolving. So all genetic counselors have a master's degree in genetic counseling and must be certified by our governing board, the American Board of Genetic Counseling, by taking a board exam. Genetic counselors overall are experts in genetics and communication. They're advocates for patients, whether they're working one-on-one with them or in the clinic or through a lab. They're educators like myself in a formal way, but as genetic counselors, they really do a lot to educate people in their community. Research is important in the field, as you'll hear from all of the speakers today, and many genetic counselors serve as administrators within their own hospital setting, university, or organization that they're part of. So when genetic counseling first started, it was mainly talking to people who were planning to have a child or already pregnant about the risk for genetic disease in that child. And that, for a while, was the most popular specialty. But now, as you can see in this circular chart, there are a large variety of specialized areas that genetic counselors work in. And for the first time on this professional status survey, cancer genetic counseling was the most popular specialty, with 52% of people in direct patient care working in that area and 39% in non-direct patient care. So for some of that, we can thank Angelina Jolie for coming public with her story about having a genetic mutation in the BRCA1 gene, but also the tremendous research that's gone into understanding the genetics behind cancer and explosion of genetic testing in that area. So we now have genetic counselors working in cardiology, pediatrics, adult genetics. Many are working in industry for genetic testing companies, public health, metabolism, pharmacogenetics, the list goes on and on. And to give you a feel for what genetic counselors do, there are so many interesting things they can be involved in. I thought it would be helpful to hear more voices than just the three of us. So I'm just going to play a short video that our professional society put together to illustrate some of the different career roles.
I am a genetic counselor.
When I'm asked what I do as a profession and I describe my role as a genetic counselor, I usually get 1,000 questions. And I love it because then I get to describe all the different things that a genetic counselor does with patients, doctors, and other medical professionals that interact to provide health care.
I think genetic counselors do touch patients in lots of different ways, and historically it's always been one-on-one in a medical setting.
Beyond that individual patient, and it's more about kind of what is the broader impact as genetic counselors we can have on healthcare.
I am a genetic counselor.
I have counseled patients and families who have literally gone decades without a specific genetic diagnosis or without understanding the cause or familial impact of their disease.
I feel like oftentimes patients get so overwhelmed with all of the jargon, with all of the medical terminology.
So I feel my value as a clinical genetic counselor is to be able to serve as a translator for these families. And because they can then understand what's going on and what the genetic testing means and what the results mean, they can become partners with the scientists and with the clinicians.
By educating healthcare providers, in turn educating the community about genetics and genomics.
I am a genetic counselor.
Like most genetic counselors, I am a tireless advocate for my patients. And it's not because I have to, it's because I want to.
As a consultant to a company that does a lot of genetic testing, and in that genetic testing where they've used me is to say, so what do you think about this? Or do you see any potential problems with this? Is there something we haven't thought about? So that of course makes you feel great.
I, as a genetic counselor, serve on many different committees, national and federal committees. As a genetic counselor, I'm able to come in representing the genetic counseling profession and also thinking about our patients, our consumers who go through these healthcare systems.
When I work with the laboratory, sometimes I'm the voice reminding them that it's not just a test, that there's a patient and a family that's depending on the results.
I am a genetic counselor.
What excites me the most about becoming a genetic counselor is just the opportunity to work with patients and bring genetic medicine, which is essentially personalized medicine, into their quality of healthcare.
As a program director, I am responsible for training genetic counseling students who will be the future genetic counselors providing this valuable service for all of our patients and families.
As a genetic counselor who conducts research, I'm looking at ways that we can better deliver genetic information to patients.
Genetic counseling is a major part of today's movement toward personalized healthcare.
Research I do is research that helps understand how people use genetic information to their benefit and how we can use that evidence to help our patients. As a genetic counselor in public health, I focus on healthcare delivery systems and how genetic services fit within the overall healthcare delivery system.
My job impacts an entire population.
I am a genetic counselor.
As a genetic counselor over the years, I feel that I've had the opportunity to have positions in many different areas of medicine. And I feel that the impact that I've had over the course of those many different opportunities is really the opportunity to be the voice for my patients.
So I feel like a bridge as a genetic counselor between the science that is advancing very rapidly and the people and the families on the front lines of these diseases.
I know I'm making an impact because patients and families tell me I am every day.
I am a genetic counselor.
All right, I will get over them not asking me to be in the video. So Melanie already gave you a great introduction to what I would have said if I was in the video. One of my favorite things about this profession is that I'm able to have my hands in so many different things that I enjoy. So at the hospital, I work in both a prenatal clinic and the neurology clinic. Here at Brandeis, I'm involved in teaching courses, advising research projects, admissions to our program, strategic planning of our program. It's been great to be involved with many people locally, but also nationally in our profession by getting involved in the National Society of Genetic Counselors and our other professional organizations. And I think one of my absolute favorite things to do is what we're doing here today is spreading knowledge about our fairly young profession and all the exciting things that someone can do with this training. And so currently, there's still less than 5,000 genetic counselors in the country, this actually represents a 95% increase from 2008, and we're not done growing. So the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics projects a growth rate of 29% from 2016 to 2026. And just to give you kind of context for that number, a sort of typical growth rate for professions is more like 7% over time. So this is a field where you will have multiple job options when you graduate. And as a profession, we were very excited that this CareerCast article came out just a few weeks ago that voted genetic counseling as the #1 profession. They were right about that. They were really wrong about the median salary. They listed as $74,000. So I'm happy to say it's much higher than that now. But I think there's been a lot of pieces like this in the lay media that have come out sort of seeing the strengths that many of us see in our own profession. So now to just shift gears a little bit and talk about genetic counseling training. So the two organizations that have their hands most in that are the Association of Genetic Counseling Program Directors, which is an organization of all the leadership teams from the programs within the United States and Canada. And then to be a training program, you need to be accredited by the Accreditation Council of Genetic Counseling. And so there's actually a shortage of genetic counselors in the United States. There's not enough graduates to fill the jobs as they're coming up. And so one way that programs are trying to deal with this shortage is by admitting more students into each individual program. And so you can see that over the last decade that the numbers of students admitted is increasing. This year in 2018, there's 404 students who will be entering their programs in the fall. And part of the bottleneck is that the training does involve clinical internships, so it'd be hard to take like 100 students at a program because you need to have their clinical training opportunities. But the second way to increase the number of students is to increase the number of training programs. So there's really been an explosion in the number of training programs across the country. And so as science librarians, you may find yourself in a school that now is thinking of starting a genetic counseling program, or just a genetic counseling program that's closer to you, that's in development, which may make many of your own students more interested. So right now there's 43 programs in the US and Canada, 39 in the US, and the other 4 in Canada. And there also are 6 programs in the process of becoming accredited. And I expect that there will be many more along the way because of the intense growth expected in the profession. So the field is pretty competitive to get admitted to, so I'm glad that I went to school in the days when it was a bit easier to get in, perhaps. And so in terms of admissions, an undergraduate student would need to take coursework in the sciences like chemistry, biology, psychology, statistics. They all need to take the GRE unless they've had another advanced degree. Sometimes they can be exempted from that. Exposure to the profession is important, either through shadowing or conversations with genetic counselors, professions. We want to know that people understand what the profession is and that it would be a good fit. Because many genetic counselors work in a clinic with individuals who have to make tough decisions or in crisis, it is helpful for people to have exposure to crisis counseling, either by volunteering at a crisis hotline or text line, Planned Parenthood, to make sure that they are good at communicating with people, especially in tough times. Related work experience, it's not uncommon for people to take a gap year or years in between undergraduate and graduate school. So either working in research, there's now this blossoming job opportunity called a genetic counselor assistant, where the individual assists genetic counselors in clinic doing tasks that are a bit simpler, and research experience. That's sort of the preliminary steps. You also would write an essay and get letters of recommendation, and then a subset of the applicant pool is invited for interviews. So as the number of programs have grown and the number of students in programs has grown, we've realized as a profession that we need to change our admission strategy. So this was the first year that we used something called a match, which is similar to what medical students do when they're applying to residency. So basically all the programs that students interviewed at, they'd put on a rank list if they would consider that program, and similarly the programs ranked all the applicants that we interviewed. So there were a little over 1,300 unique applicants for the match. And 771 submitted a list. So the reason that there was such a drop-off was some of those individuals who did not submit a list did not get interviews, or interview places and decided not to rank them, or withdrew for another reason. So of that 771, only 52% matched. So what this is telling us as a profession, there's a lot more people interested in the profession than we can accommodate right now. So the hope is that we'll be able to expand the programs enough that we can get more of these students into the profession. So once a student's actually in graduate school, most programs are 2 years. I'd say the shorter ones are 18 months. One program is 2.5 years that has more of an emphasis on research. And the programs are all structured slightly different, but they all have to meet the same accreditation requirements from the ACGC. So the students do didactic coursework in clinical genetics, human genetics, psychology, courses on genetic counseling as a profession. They also have experiential learning. So basically they're seeing patients under supervision in medical centers. They're also working in partnership with genetic counselors working in laboratories, advocacy groups, public health. Our students at Brandeis do an internship where they're working with individuals affected with medical conditions. And then all students do a research project as part of their training. I would say for most programs, it's a year-long individual project done with a committee, like a thesis. Some programs do have the students work in groups. Upon graduation, students generally take the ABGC board exam either in August or February of that year. And then some states, not all at this point, require a license. So then students also need to get a license in those states. So just to finish by talking about genetic counselors in a library, I thought this cartoon was relevant to us because genetics is an area that's moving so fast. There's a few cardinal textbooks that kind of go over general philosophy of being a genetic counselor, but textbooks for the most part are not useful in our profession because by the time they get published, they're completely out of date. So we are definitely of a more web-based profession using more current journal articles to conduct our work rather than textbooks. Importantly, as a profession, as we've grown, and more of an emphasis has been imparted on genetic counselors publishing papers and doing evidence-based research to show why genetic counseling is important. And so this is a figure from the 2018 Professional Status Survey, and basically the different colors represent people in direct patient care and non-direct patient care, and the different types of responsibilities they have related to research. So I think to me the important take home from this graph is that genetic counselors across all areas of the profession are doing research, publishing, and should be doing more research as part of their job. And very exciting that some genetic counselors have even been offered grant funding, some very large grants for research. So you can see even across different specialty areas, genetic counselors can be the principal investigator, co-investigator, or co-PI on research projects. And publications is also something that we participate in quite frequently. So the most frequent is to do an abstract or poster or oral presentation at a conference. But certainly as a profession as a whole, we're trying to push people to be more active in publishing our work to move the profession forward. One step in this area is in terms of professional guidelines. And so there's certain common indications that come up enough that we feel like as a profession, it's important to provide evidence-based advice on how to proceed in certain situations. So in 2015, the Society basically formed a committee to focus on professional guidelines and give instructions on how these should be written. So right now there are 4 groups working on the first set of professional guidelines: expanded carrier screening, epilepsy, hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, and hereditary cancer. So I'm actually on the committee for the expanded carrier screening, which is basically a way of testing prospective parents for hundreds of diseases at the same time. There's many different labs doing it, so it's kind of a free-for-all right now, and there really needs to be more guidance. Lacey, who you'll hear from later, is actually on the epilepsy guidelines committee, and she can tell you more about her work there. So Melanie has been really helpful to me to explain to me what a systematic review is and a scoping review, because that's our first step in that project. Similarly, there's some other publications that are less evidence-based, but called a practice resource guideline. So as the profession grows, genetic counselors will be more prominent in writing these kind of publications. So I think which journals genetic counselors use the most is going to vary upon their specialty area, because some genetic counselors are so specialized that they might find a cardiology journal or neurology journal more useful than the general ones. But I'd say the big 2 in our field are the American Journal of Medical Genetics and the Journal of Genetic Counseling. As a prenatal genetic counselor, the one that I find to be most useful in that specialty is prenatal diagnosis. But I think Guy and Lacey will have a different set of materials given that they work in very different areas than I do. And so just wanted to finish on and how I use the library across all of my different roles as a genetic counselor in clinical care, teaching, research project, and scholarship. I didn't make an individual slide about teaching, but I think given that we're working in a field where everything's changing so fast, I do really pull out upon the current literature to teach my students. So I make sure that they enter not only their internships, but the profession with a current working knowledge of the field. In clinical care, I've already mentioned the professional guidelines. Being able to research diagnoses is incredibly important when you're working in rare disease. So for example, last summer, I had a patient in the prenatal clinic who was carrying a pregnancy with a rare chromosome difference. And there were only maybe 15 reports of this difference that we could find in the literature, and it was my job as the genetic counselor along with our team to figure out what this difference really meant for our baby. So it was really important to find every single case in the literature about this change, if there's only 15 of them, to give her the best information possible. As genetic testing has evolved, it gets more complex in understanding the meaning of a particular change in our DNA, and I think Lacey will talk about this more in her work, but there are many different databases available that genetic counselors may use to understand the meaning of a database of a variant besides the medical literature. And then in terms of scholarship, so there's definitely a push in our field as a whole to publish more and get our work out there. So 2 steps I've taken in this way is the Expanded Carrier Screening Guidelines Committee, which has been rewarding to work with people all over the country and understand the process of really generating an appropriate review. With one of my colleagues, we recently wrote a book chapter together that is in process of being edited about ultrasound markers for chromosome abnormalities. So it's similar to the expanded carrier screening, but looking back, maybe I should have taken more of a systematic approach in writing that chapter. And then research is part of my job, mainly in advising student projects, which I've advised many of over the years that I've been in the field. So the projects that I've been involved in over the last, decade, I guess, one of my biggest passions is workforce issues. So like this year I was on a project where the student was looking at supervisors across the country and how many students do they supervise, can they take more, it was really the first study in the field to actually look at their opinion, which is important as we're thinking about expanding the field. I've also been on projects that are patient focused, so a student had looked at young adults at risk for Huntington's disease and sort of how they proceed with reproductive testing. These projects tend to be a year long and use either quantitative or qualitative methods. The students are really good about submitting them to be presented either in a poster or a presentation at our national meeting, and I very strongly recommend that my students submit it for publication. And finally, I had a student listen this year, and hers has been submitted and will hopefully be published this year. I am involved in clinical research, mainly in neurology. This study is wrapped up, but I was involved in the Parkinson's Progression Markers Initiative study, which is under the Michael J. Fox Foundation. So basically it was a study looking at biomarkers of Parkinson's disease, including genetic factors, with the hope of finding an effective treatment. And I'm just about to start on the Generation study, which is a study on a clinical trial with a drug to be given to people thought to be high risk for Alzheimer's disease by both genetic testing, family history, and brain imaging. So I think that will be an exciting experience. So hopefully that gives you an overview of what we do, and my passion for the field comes across. I think the field is rapidly expanding, and medical literature is such an important source of helping not only our profession move forward, but allowing genetic counselors to provide information to their students and patients alike. So thank you for your attention, and thank you for everything you do. You've probably seen a lot of library cartoons at the end of presentations, but I thought this one was perfect. What's a 9-letter word for indispensable? Librarian. Because I really credit Melanie for helping me so much in my first year of the faculty here, from doing workshops for my students on how to find appropriate literature, to giving me resources for reviews, really our field could not do what we do without the appropriate information. So thank you to all of you for helping us find it and for sending interested students our way to enter the profession.